So thank you again, Kathleen, for that very generous introduction. Also a really excellent and very comprehensive overview of the three workshops over the next few months on this topic, important topic about multilingualism, which clearly has a lot of resonance. It's not just something which is of interest historically, but is also really important to us today in a multicultural world that we live in, and the complexities around speaking different languages, sometimes over the top of each other. And that word babble actually in English is quite an interesting one, as I'm sure many of us know, is the sort of word that you might use to refer to that kind of cacophony that you sometimes, if you walk into a classroom and you hear all the voices at the same time, that simultaneous nature of human speech, and you can't quite make out those conversations, individual conversations, because everybody's speaking over the top of each other. So we sometimes might think of the city as being a little like that, being a cacophony, lots of different voices, different speeches, different conversations, all competing with each other at the same time as a kind of simultaneous aspect to all those conversations. And the difficulty, I suppose, and the challenge is to begin to disaggregate or disentangle some of those competing conversations. And I'm choosing the word polyvocality here in the title of my talk. So I think polyvocality, a range of different voices, is something which we can begin to perhaps use in our analyses of what was going on in the past, but also what is going on still in the present day today. The subtitle, Mapping Spaces and Places of Urban Multilingualism. The word I want to emphasize there is the mapping word. So what I'm going to be providing you with this morning is very much a visual exploration of multilingualism. And that might seem a bit of a strange thing, almost a paradox, to visualize language, to see it through maps. But again, it speaks to this idea of polyvocality, of how do we begin to see into the past, to understand those different voices, those different conversations, how they related to the spaces and places of the city, and how they related to the communities living within those places, not just within cities, of course, but across and between cities. Communication has been mentioned already by Kathleen. Communication, of course, is key in this discussion around multilingualism and language, the use of language, of how we connect and communicate and relate to each other as communities. So Babel then, I thought it'd be interesting to just to reflect a bit on that, but let me move straight into the case study. Now, what I don't want to do in my talk is to overwhelm you with lots of details about the case study location. And I'm speaking in relation to Eurasia, I suppose, very much on the edge of the world, on the edge here, and also Chester, the kind of central theme really for looking at Chester is its marginal location, and I'm going to come on to that in due course. And as Kathleen mentioned, I have with colleagues like Catherine Clark and others, Helen Fulton, who are linguists. They are experts in language, I should say, and not like me, an historical geographer with an interest in maps. But Chester, I think, provides us with some interesting insights into the kinds of questions that Kathleen was highlighting in her introduction there, and which I have begun to reflect upon by the very kind invitation to take part in this series of set of workshops, which I've begun to reflect upon a little bit more. So the image there is actually more or less contemporary with the painting of the Tower of Babel, which you saw earlier on, which, as you know, is from the 1560s. And here we have an image of a city. This is the city of Chester, a perspective sketch showing the city in side view, if you like, in bird's eye view, from 1588 by William Smith. And you'll see on that drawing there the river Dee, the walls around the city, all the kinds of things that we might associate with what the characteristics of what our cities have: the walls, the towers, in this case for churches, the packed buildings, the streets, the gates, and so on and so forth. So how does the city speak is one of the things that I really want to begin to address through my talk this morning with you. How does the city speak to us today over time and through space? But also, how does the city speak collectively. The point of today's workshop is around administration, and thinking about the municipality, the governance of cities, the city being a kind of a body in itself, and it's having a voice, probably through the mayor or through a particular elected official. And that's one way of thinking about how the city speaks, but also the city speaks through its citizens, through those many people, the multitudes, with their multilingualism in the city itself. And of course, the city speaks through how it is represented, how it is mediated in this particular image through language, a language of maps, a visual language of maps, the icons, the things we recognize, what we can pick up on when we look at a map, but also the writing on a map. Maps are not just visual things, they're also textual things. So how does a city speak is a kind of key question, I think, for us to think about, reflect upon. And when we do listen to the city, whose voices do we hear? So are they the loudest voices? What about the quietest voices? There are here then a set of power relations at work, which we need to, I think, build into our discussions and reflect upon, which again, Katalin highlighted. And it was interesting to see how geographies of power is one of those cluster topics. And I think those three cluster topics, actually, geographies of power, communication, mobility, you can see I wrote them down, identities and religions, are all interwoven into the kind of discussions we're having around multilingualism and the city. And I dare say when we come to it, although the workshops are themed around administrative, religious and commercial aspects of multilingualism, there are, of course, ways in which these are all interwoven. And I think it's that disaggregation of those different themes, which again, I think will be really interesting through these three workshops. So whose voices do we hear is something we might want to kind of come back to. And it's one of the things I want to explore through my talk this morning by focusing on Chester and thinking a little bit about those whose voices we do hear through the sources that we have available to us, and thinking critically and spatially about those sources. And when we do so, the city as a sonic space and as a place of locution. Locution is an interesting word. One of my colleagues here, Dermot Finnegan at Queen's, geographer, has spent quite a lot of his recent time working on locution and location, and it's a nice alliterative play on words, of course. But locution is an interesting way of thinking about the importance of place in how we articulate ourselves through language. Through phrases, through idioms, through dialect, and all these sorts of things, as well as the language itself. So locution is something we might again want to factor into our discussions. And this broader point about whether the urban landscape is a cacophony, a babble of different competing, overlapping voices, or whether we can disaggregate some of those into the different layers of language. And that's something I want to try and do today through looking at Chester as an example, disaggregating the layers by which the city was formed and thinking about their linguistic connections, but also looking at particular points in time in that process to look a little bit more at the place of locution within Chester, those conversations, the languages that were being used and the implications that they have. So that's really where I'm going with this in terms of the broader points of the talk. I want to just mention a little bit about polyvocality since it's in my title, and I made a point of saying it's important for us. And another Queen's connection here, this paper, fairly recent paper, looking and thinking critically about polyvocality. And I thought it was very pertinent actually to what I'm trying to do here, where polyvocality is described where various voices are made visible through dialogic encounters rooted in diverse ways of knowing and experiencing the world. While our maps are ways of knowing and experiencing the world, the image there you see is another one from Smith from 1588, but this time more perhaps as an aerial view, not quite a planimetric view of the city of Chester, but a different perspective, looking down more on the city rather than that side view that we had earlier. But also the point here in this quotation, which I liked, was how the various voices are made visible. And again, it's that interrelationship between the spoken, the oral, and also the visual and the visible, which again, there seem to be two ends of the spectrum. But actually, when we begin to look at multilingualism and how it works in the city, being visible is a really important part of being heard. And that's, again, something I'll be coming on to later when we think about marginality and liminality in the city, and whose voices we hear and whose voices we perhaps don't hear so loudly. So polyvocality then, a multiplicity of voices, of hearing these voices, these various voices, thinking about how they come to us, how we hear them through visual sources like the maps I'm going to be using, for example, and how those maps themselves are part of this broader sort of conception understanding of our experience of the world, how we relate to the world around us, and how that world, of course, is communicated to us. So Kathleen very kindly mentioned a couple of projects, which I will just flag up here. Mapping Medieval Chester was the earliest one, the first, and its focus was really on thinking about the city of Chester, which is here, for those who who need to, as a geographer, I like to have a map, of course, and be able to point out where these places are. So Chester is indicated by the yellow dot there. The red part of that map, you'll probably pick up the outline of England and Wales there, and the various counties represented by the lines. So we've got England and then Wales more or less merging into each other on that particular map. And the red area is an area known as the Marches, or the March of Wales. And march, the word march itself means border or frontier. And where Chester is situated is very much in that March district or zone. It's sort of betwixt and between. It looks to England, but it also looks to Wales. So it looks to the English, thinking about language here, and it looks to the Welsh. And it's that position between those two linguistic sort of zones or areas, if you like, historically, which I think makes Chester quite a useful case study for us, because it's always betwixt and between. It played a very important role in defining this frontier area after the Norman conquest, after 1066. And the Norman conquest of England, and the setting up of what were called marcher lordships. And there were three cities which were the seats of those marcher lordships, Chester, Hereford, and Shrewsbury, and they formed a line, more or less, where Chester is here, a line down to the River Severn to the south. So this peripheral liminal borderland location then, I think, means Chester for us has particular resonance and relevance for thinking about language and its relationship to cities and multilingualism, because it is between Wales and England and has long occupied that particular position. Mapping Medieval Chester was a study of a particular set of sources, some of which I'll be talking about today, relating to medieval Chester, especially late medieval Chester. Discover Medieval Chester was what we call knowledge transfer in the UK context, which is to think about how can we communicate our academic research to wider and more diverse audiences. And so a tour, games, etc. was set up, and an artwork as well. And it's the artwork I want to come back to at the very end of my talk. Place and identity was at the kind of core of our Mapping Medieval Chester project. And how do we think about place and identity? Well, through language. So language is absolutely central to this. And we have in the project team, or had, the project was about 15 years ago now, historians of literature, English literature. Catherine Clark was the PI, and the co-investigator, along with myself, was Helen Fulton. Both of whom are experts in medieval language and medieval literature. Helen working on Welsh texts, and Catherine working especially on Middle English and Old English texts. The city itself has got a long and big and wide bibliography, which I don't want to get bogged down in the Chester details. This is not a talk to the Chester local history group, it's a talk about thinking of Chester and its polyvocality, its multilingualism. But at least I wanted to flag up that, of course, all of us work within a much broader framework, intellectual framework. And I think Chester helps us to explore multilingualism in pre-modern societies, even though it is geographically, I suppose, quite peripheral, quite marginal to the core of the workshops, the geographical focus anyway, of the workshops over the next few months. Now, I'm going to start with something more broad, really, about not so much language, but sounds, because in the humanities, and especially the digital and spatial humanities, there's been quite a lot of interest and interesting research done recently on thinking about cities and their sounds, how sound operates within the city, how we hear within the city through different sounds, not just voices, so not just spoken language, the communication of people, but the communication through, for example, through the ringing of bells. So this is some work that, as you can see, there's been done by Niall Atkinson here on Florence, on Renaissance Florence. And the quotation there comes from that particular article. And the map being used there picks out the points of those bells which were ringing out across Florence. And what Atkinson is interested in here is the sonic city. He's thinking about how we can map out these different soundscapes and think about how sound was, as he says here, at the heart of the production of civic society and urban space. So if we think about multilingualism, we think about language, it's part of this broader sonic landscape, a broader landscape of soundscapes, if it's a word that's often used to describe these, of these different, as he says, discordant noises of its restless inhabitants. So as well as all these different voices, the babble, the cacophony, if you like, the simultaneous conversations in the city, we also have these other kind of competing sounds. And I think it's worth us really sort of reflecting on that in terms of what we're talking about in the workshops, but methodologically as well, it begins to show the importance of mapping in all of this, of how we begin to visualize sound in the city. For Renaissance Florence, of course, there are the maps like the one you've just seen. But if we move into the medieval context, as with Chester, then it becomes much more difficult to, we have a map, if you like the map I showed you by Smith from 1588, but it's, again, not really what we might call a medieval map. It's a bit too late. So it's necessary to create new maps. And that's part of what my research is involved, is mapping cities, mapping medieval urban landscapes, but using a variety of different sources, archaeological, historical, textual, topographical, cartographic, etc., and to amalgamate these within a geographical information system. And this map that you're looking at here is Chester, but there are two maps, one superimposed on the other. There's my reconstruction of a map of medieval Chester, creating a modern map of the medieval city, if you like, which I've superimposed on a modern aerial image, which is the power of the geographical information system, of course. It enables us to juxtapose and connect maps of different layers at different time periods and relate the medieval city, in this case, to the modern city, which in itself is a powerful thing to do. But it makes the point that we need to spend time, I think, when we're looking at medieval spaces and places, spend time on aggregating these different sources. It's quite a laborious process, quite a technical process, and I certainly don't want to spend a lot of time explaining the technicalities, but I did want to at least flag because I'll be using maps like the one I've just shown you in my talk. Something what lies behind the map or beneath the map is a series of decision-making processes about selectively digitizing content from archaeological sources, from cartographic sources, putting these together in a large database. And you can see there, for example there, Eastgate Street. And the Middle English street name there is Eastgate Street. You see that highlighted in blue. And the name, the date when the name, the historical source we're using here is again quite late, 1526. And then we can relate that topographical information to the places in the urban landscape through digitizing. And by doing that, we end up in our geographic information system with a series of features, urban features, which we can create a symbology for. That's the menu on the left-hand side, different colors representing different features, and then using that information to create our map. So this is really the basis of a lot of what I want to be talking about today, and thinking about language and multilingualism in the context of the medieval city, and how we might begin to visualize that, but also begin to use the map as a tool to help us to think through some of those issues around how people speak to each other, how the city speaks to us. So this is our modern map of medieval Chester, or very late medieval Chester, circa 1500. And as you can see, I'm going to pick out some of the features a little later on, but it is a city. As you can see, the River Dee, circling around the city, the walled city itself, picked out there, a city with a large eastern suburb. Wales, I should point out, is to the south here, which might seem a little bit odd, but Wales is situated on the other side of the River Dee being historically the boundary between Wales off to the west and England off to the east. The roads to the north from Chester and the roads to the east then led towards England. The one to the east led towards London, whereas the one to the south led towards Wales. And to the west of the city then you have the River Dee and the port and the quay, which of course led to the Atlantic, the wider world, the Irish Sea. And it's all of these different influences from north, south, east and west that we can begin to see converging and characterizing the multilingual city that Chester is in the medieval period. But our maps as a two-dimensional representation simplify, perhaps oversimplify what the experience of this being in the city was really about when we think about language and communication. And although this is a 19th century, it's a wonderful watercolor showing you Watergate Street, the street that was leading out towards the west, towards the River Dee. Water leading to the River Dee, that's why it's called Watergate. The street itself here thronged with people, and I think it's such a powerful and evocative image. Although it's, as I said, it's 19th century, the urban landscape at this point in time is largely still characterized by buildings, as you can see here, from the late medieval period, certainly, if not the early Renaissance period. And one of the things I want to draw your attention to is if you look at where not just the people in the street and all the busyness there, but the people looking down on the street, and they are in conversation. You see on the right-hand side, this is one of the things about not being in the room with you. I can't see the nods, but if you look to the right-hand side, you'll see these balconies. And this is a very important aspect of the urban landscape of medieval Chester, and indeed, actually, as far as we know, was unique for medieval England. To have these, they're called rows, R-O-W-S in the plural, rows, the Chester rows, they still exist. And it's the elevated walkways. These are interconnected. They look like separate balconies, but they are actually interconnected. So if you trace your eye from right to left, you'll see sometimes you have these wooden balconies, but sometimes a bit further on, you can see stone columns. So this is sort of elevated walkway above the street itself. And I like this image because it really encapsulates the way in which the city, Chester itself, worked in terms of its language, in terms of its conversations, the dialogues on an everyday basis. And it invites us to think, when we look at those earlier maps, they're very clinical. But when we look at an image like this, it's much more human. And I think it's important for us to remind ourselves that what we're really thinking about when we talk about language is this communication. And those two people on the right-hand side on the balcony, imagining, I know this is all we can do, but imagining how these spaces and places were being used and vocalized and verbalized at the time they were constructed. The rows date to around sometime in the 13th century. Again, there's this debate around that, which I won't go into. There's even a suggestion that the idea for them came from a connection with the Byzantine world and especially with Constantinople. So these sort of ideas about the movement of architectural design and urban design, again, points to language and communication. How do we end up with the rows in Chester all the way from Constantinople, which I quite like because, of course, it speaks to the kind of wider context of our workshops. But the reason I've got this image here is just to remind us of the three-dimensional urban landscape, and our maps compress things to 2 dimensions. We really need to think in 3 dimensions. So the talk I'm going to give you, I'm just looking at the time now, really having provided some context there, thinking a little bit critically, I hope, about polyvocality, thinking a little bit about the city as a soundscape, as a sonic city, but also thinking about the importance of maps and visualizing the city and trying to use maps as ways of understanding that multilingual complexity that we see in the medieval city. So what I want to do in the next part of my talk really is deal with 3 different themes, which are artificially separating out this complexity into three different topics. The first is to think a little bit more about Chester itself. But again, I don't want to get bogged down in the details with Chester. I want to really think about how we need, when we're looking at multilingualism, not just to think about the city itself, but how it interconnects with other places around it. So thinking about the location of a particular city and its linguistic place and setting is something I want to reflect on first. Then I want to look into the city itself, recognizing that the city evolves over time. It's a fluid, the urban landscape is fluid, it changes shape over time. And that changing shape over time connects with different cultural influences. And again, Chester is a good example of this. So I want to try and link their orality, so language, speaking, and the voicing of the city with this changing shaping of the city itself through a process of deep mapping. Then I'm going to move to that's first part, is about who do we hear? And we can access our various mappings, use our various mappings as ways of accessing our different voices, our different languages. The third part about location and locution is looking more specifically at places and spaces within the urban landscape to think about the local places where we are heard, but also places where we are not heard. The importance of thinking about marginality, liminality, the silencing, the othering of some in urban communities, and the prioritizing, privileging of others as well. Often the civic elite, in fact, as you'll see, by putting themselves at the very center, the very heart of a city, and giving themselves very strong vocal positions within the city itself. So I would say a little bit more there about where do we hear, the importance of locality, and also how locality relates to locution, this idea of different expressions of speech. And then the fourth point is polyphony, is the complexity, the various languages. What do we hear in the city? And so I want to draw back a little bit to think about the wider, again, networks within which cities are situated. And to use this idea of Manuel Castells about the city as a space of flow, but to play on that a little bit, the spaces of flows and their importance in cities, both between cities and connecting cities and the people within those places, but also the intra-urban spatial patterns and speech that we find in looking at places within a city. And then the last point there is about timing. So clearly time is really important, not just the chronological time, but the time of the everyday, the way in which the everyday daily patterns or weekly patterns, cyclical patterns of the civic year, of the city's year are important in the kinds of conversations, but also kinds of languages that are being used in a city. So that relates to the temporal patterns. So let's start then with this question about thinking more of the importance of geography in thinking more on the complexities of multilingualism and the city, and looking at, in this particular case, at a series of maps or visual representations to help us begin to explore this. Who do we hear? Now, this is, again, it's a map actually from later than the medieval period. This is from the 1560s by Humphrey Cloyd. The earliest map that we actually have that shows Wales as a geographical entity, as opposed to being part of Britain or connected with England. So it is a map which purports to show, it's called the Cambriae Typus. So it is an image, the figure of Wales. It's interesting in a number of levels. The one I've done a little bit of work on this map is at the National Library of Wales, or many printed versions of it, but some of the earliest examples are in the National Library of Wales, where this image comes from. Those of you who know your geography of Wales might be somewhat puzzled or perplexed to see that actually Humphrey Cloyd here, who was himself a Welshman, you can probably tell that from the name, from the northeast of Wales, actually represents Wales to be much larger than it really is. So he's extended the eastern edge of Wales, the boundary, up to the River Severn, which historically and sort of mythologically, if you like, is the territorial claim of Wales and the Welsh to a much larger Cambria, it's called, And that over time, you remember the marches that I showed you earlier, the map of the marches, over time with the Norman conquest and English colonization in Wales in the medieval period, that boundary of Wales has shifted further westwards, diminishing the size of Wales, and also been cemented in the reign of Henry VIII through a series of statutes where it becomes the modern day boundary of Wales, a fixed entity, if you like. And what we find looking at this map is there we have Chester indicated. And I like this map because it begins to help us to think about that linguistic divide, which relates to Chester, but I'm sure as well will relate to many of our cities when we begin to think about mapping their locations and thinking of their complex relationships to broader hinterlands and to broader territories. And also the thing about Cloyd here, which again I think is worthy of some note, is he's interested, is a very much a sort of polymath of the late Renaissance in Wales, and was very well connected and travelled widely across Europe, in fact, and especially in Italy. And on this map itself, it's quite an academic instrument in many ways. So on the one hand, it speaks to this earlier pre-16th century Wales, a Wales of antiquity, if you like, which is much larger and much broader than it was in Lloyd's own day in the 16th century after the statutes. But on his map here, he highlights, and here you see for Chester, for each place name or significant place name, he has three languages. He has Chester in Latin at the top there, the Civitas Legionum, relating to the city of legions. It was a Roman city. Well, actually, it was a Roman fortress. Let's be precise here. There was a civilian settlement outside the fortress, but it was actually a fortress. Then we have the word, the place name, sorry, in Welsh, or as he puts it there, British. And Welsh actually means foreigner in English, or Old English. So he uses Britain here, B for Britain, and Caer, the word there, Caer, C-A-E-R, is Welsh for fortress. And then we have underneath it Chester, in English is put A for Anglia, Chester, and the word Chester comes from the Old English or Anglo-Saxon word for cester, which again means a fortified place. So in this map here, he's compressing the three important languages, the multilingual nature, not just of Chester, but of this broader area that we're looking at in the context of the Welsh marches. And this is the man himself, Humphrey Cloyd. As I said, as I mentioned, travelled very widely across Europe and lived in northeast Wales. He would have known Chester well himself. He probably would also have known this particular authority. Ranulph Higden was one of the most important English historians, chroniclers from the middle part of the 14th century. And why am I showing you Higden's work here? Well, he was an incumbent of St. Werburgh's Abbey in Chester. He was a Cestrian. He was himself from the city, or lived in the city at St. Werburgh's. And what I like about this this particular mappa mundi, as you see on the left-hand side, and the geographical textual description on the right-hand side, is that Higden begins to open up the place of Chester, the place of Britain on the edge of the world. You can see it just about in the bottom left-hand part of the mappa mundi. I'm not sure if my arrow thing works here, but I'm talking about this area down here. And he reflects on, again, it's a play on words, but the etymology, the meaning of England, Anglia, and he points to one of the reasons why Anglia is called Anglia is because it's on the angle or the edge of the world. So for Higden, he was very much thinking about the place, not just of Chester, but of Britain in this wider world, and all those different languages and part of this wider linguistic community we see and we read through Higden's Polychronicon. It's the world, if you like, being brought to Chester through Higden. That's St. Werburgh's Abbey Gate on the left-hand side. And this idea of Britain, or England rather, really being on the edge of the world is something that's followed through in Cathy Levetza's really brilliant book, Angels on the Edge of the World, where she begins to look at this relationship between geography and identity, and using maps as a way of mediating that relationship. And this is a later version of the Higden map. It's a very influential map and circulates widely around England and is picked up by other monastic communities in producing their Mappa Mundi. Higden is interesting the way he brings the world to Chester, but we also have another incumbent of St. Werburgh's Abbey, an earlier one. This is Lucian. We don't know his full name, but it's Lucian of Chester, who wrote this sort of laudatory, so in praise of Chester, De Laude Chestri in the top there. And he wrote this very long and interesting description of the city of Chester, placing Chester again in the wider context, the wider world. And in doing so, he begins to open up to us a new kind of way of visualizing the city and relating the city to the wider world. So the quotation here is from part of Lucian's De Laude Chestri. It is originally written in Latin. This is the English translation. And one of the things I want to mention here is this sort of symbolic or religious reading of the city, the space of the city. He says here that the two perfectly straight streets intersecting like the Blessed Cross, which form four rows culminating at the four gates, and so on and so forth. So it's still a sort of mystical reading, symbolic reading of the form of the city. And the reason I'm mentioning it here is because we don't have Lucian speaking to us, obviously, in the room, but we do have this, and I can imagine, Kathleen mentioned the sermon at the very start. I can imagine this sort of vocabulary being used, sermonizing to the people of Chester about the significance of the city. Whether, again, language is important here, whether the vernacular is being used or whether Latin is being used, which of course would have been much more limited in its comprehension to the wider community. But it nevertheless tells us something about how the city itself was being understood and its urban landscape, its streets and so on, by those at the time. He may see the text with one eye and the city with the other, Lucian says. So you can imagine he's looking at the city with one eye and his text with the other. So, and that symbolic reading is, again, a hint here to the east, perhaps to thinking about the relationship between Chester, although it's on the edge of the world, relates to the center of the medieval world, Jerusalem, of course. And we can begin to play around with the imagery that Lucian constructs through that passage there, and the imagery we see, like the so-called Crusader map, more or less contemporary with when Lucian is writing of Jerusalem itself. Okay, moving on. So with this project, Map of Medieval Chester, which I'm going to draw a little bit more upon now, then we were interested in these broader kind of linguistic landscapes. So the thinking about Chester's setting linguistically in terms of its different languages, its relationship to those languages and their relationship to identity and place, but also the text, Lucian's text in particular, Higden, and the other kind of important sources we might have, textual sources we might have, and relating those to the city through mapping. So I've looked at Chester in the broader context and thinking through our linguistic landscapes. I want to move now to thinking about the evolution, the deep mapping of the city and the linguistic landscape layers that are imprinted and fossilized in the city that becomes Chester by the time this map purports to show Chester in 1500, by the time we get to Chester at the end of our period. What are the different layers and the different influences that build up or accumulate or accrete as the landscape of the city evolves, as different cultural influences? And I like to think this is almost like the ebb and flow, the tides of different cultural groups, different linguistic groups coming to Chester, laying down, influencing what we see in Chester, inscribing the landscape with particular kinds of words, with particular kinds of features. And we still have the legacies, the landscape still has the legacies of those past cultural and linguistic influences within it. And it's trying to disaggregate those layers from the landscape and also their linguistic layers and find connections between the two that I'm trying to attempt here. The first of these is, of course, the Roman fortress itself, the outline shown here in red. We know very little actually about what happened to Chester in the 4th and 5th centuries. The suspicion is that what was St. Werburgh's Abbey later on in the medieval period, which is up here, had before it an earlier church of St. Peter. We have another earlier church over here, St. John, on the right outside the walls, from the 7th century. So this is, if you like, the inherited city, and a city that was really the Welsh, or the British, I should say, because I said Welsh, the word Welsh means foreigner, but let's think about these as the British, and the way in which their linguistic community was part of the fabric of this inherited Roman legionary fortress. But moving on in time, then we have the refoundation of the fortifications of Chester under Ethelfleda, who was the daughter of King Alfred of Wessex, and she refortified Chester with a new set of fortifications. Again, there was debate around that, but it's another linguistic layer here, from the Welsh to the Old English, to Ethelfleda speaking English, of Wessex descent, refounding, restoring Chester following its occupation by the Danish armies in around the early part of the 10th, very end of the 9th century, very early part of the 10th century. The occupation of Chester by the Danish armies, again, another linguistic layer. The reoccupation and restoration of the city and its fortification under Ethelfleda in English, and then the ultimate as well connections between Ireland and the Hiberno-Norse influences, as Chester was growing at this time, a new set of defences constructed outside the green area, a new set of suburban defences. And we see here, and you'll see shortly as well, the evidence for that, those communities from Ireland. Again, this complexity here about, were these people speaking, in what language were these people speaking? How did they communicate to each other? Were these communities, these Hiberno-Norse communities, let's say from Dublin, or people from Dublin, to what extent were they understood or integrated or acculturated into what was predominantly an Old English, an English-speaking city, the Anglo-Saxon burh? Burh just means a defended place in Old English. So, thinking about these linguistic, these overlapping languages in the context of the development of Chester, I think begins to open up some interesting issues for us to try and disentangle. And the Norman Conquest, 1066, another kind of linguistic layer now through Norman French, and as well as that, of course, English. Okay, so we don't just lose the English. The importance of Latin, clearly in the kind of religious context, has just been seen through Lucian, the continued arrival of people from Ireland and the people from Wales, bearing in mind the geographical location of Chester, which I pointed out to you already. So we can begin to map out, as you see there, those different colours, this sequence of the development of Chester and how it connects to these different linguistic communities. But this seems to me it's quite a simple model of looking at urban change over time and thinking about the dominance of particular linguistic groups or communities occupying the city over those different time periods. I think what's more interesting in a sense then is when we drill down into the details, which I'm going to do next. Before I do that, just mention the suburbs to the east and also one to the south, which are also, one to the east was almost as big or as large in its extent as the area of the Anglo-Saxon city itself. So the suburbs are really important. Their chronology, again, is somewhat difficult to disentangle. So zooming into the localities themselves, like I'm doing here with this particular example, focusing on the very centre of Chester, St. Werburgh's Abbey is just to the northeast there in that image. The 4 different inset maps there represent the same locality over that same time sequence. And the reason I'm including it here, because what I liked about it, not only did it show the topographical continuities that we see in Chester over those long time periods, the streets surviving for long time periods, but although there's continuity in the urban landscape, there are these linguistic changes. So the phrase, the words being used to describe the streets in Old English, top right, into Middle English, bottom left, and into the modern English, bottom right. So the same place being described, overwritten, if you like, by different languages over the time periods. So let's zoom in a little bit more into the localities themselves and think a little bit more about those conversations and how people related to each other. the first thing to start is, since we're talking here about administration in this particular workshop, I thought it would be interesting to think a little bit about how the civic in the city, the administration, the elites, the civic elite in the city occupied places, very visible places, but what that also means in terms of their voices and how they are heard as the elite in an urban community. So not only is the apparatus of the civic city, the municipality, if you want to use that word, at the very heart of Chester, the centre of that cross of streets that Lucian describes there. So all the apparatus, the cross, the market hall, the gallows, the pentis, which you'll see in a minute, the pillory, so the places where people were actually tried and then punished. Very visible, but also very oral. And I think this is the thing about to emphasize is about the visibility of the civic elite, but also their orality, how they're also being heard. So this is an image of the pentis. It's that structure which has been attached to St. Peter's Church, which looks right down onto, a bit like the rows were looking down onto the street, but looks right down onto the cross, the very heart of the city. And the pentis, this structure here, this wooden structure, was a way for not only the civil elite to be seen, but also to be heard. And it's that relationship between being seen and being heard that I want to emphasize here, because it actually then helps privilege those elites, positions them in a position of authority, and in this case literally elevates them above the city streets, above the communality of the city itself, by putting the pentis is used for purposes of justice and law and so on, and hearing pleas and that kind of thing. So it makes this this process, this oral process, very visible and visual in the city. So that's what's going on at the center. What's going on at the edge is also interesting as well. So let's think a little bit about marginality. And one of the things I want to do that is to look at two particular communities which are represented by parishes. They've got St. Bridget, which, as you can imagine from the saint's name here, from the dedication, represents a community probably emanating from Ireland. Again, the chronology is not particularly clear, but since it's in the part of the city which was restored by Ethelfleda in the early 10th century, we might assume that community, which is picked out in brown here, just in case you're wondering here. The white dotted lines are the earlier defences of the burh, the defended city as it was under Ethelfleda, and then we have this extension to the burh out towards the south here. So St. Bridget is a church occupying just beside the gate into that inner burh area, that inner fortified area. On the other side of the street, we have the Church of St. Michael. At the corner of the defences, we have the Church of St. Martin. If we go to the north, to the next gate, we have the Church of Holy Trinity. So all four sides of the city are protected spiritually by these churches at key gates, key locations. And their dedications remind us of the communities who are occupying those particular places. And St. Bridget or St. Bride is a reminder of the potentially Irish or Hiberno-Norse community, the community from Ireland, and interestingly occupying an area just within the gate of the city. If we move to the south, we have this little area, defended area just outside the inner area, and then the suburbs, what would have been the suburbs in the 10th century. And here we have another church. This one is dedicated to St. Olav or St. Olaf. And this reminds us of another community which was important despite the Danish occupation and Viking occupation of Chester in the late 9th century. By the 10th century, we do see an occupation and a more kind of commercial basis of traders and so on within Chester, representing a Hiberno-Norse community. And this church dedication, again, is part of that. And it's an interesting position, whether or not this more peripheral position reflects that rather more marginal place in society of those who came after, as it were, after the restoration of Chester by Ethelfleda. I'm getting into the details here, but the broader point is that we have two communities here, one on the inside and one on the outside. And we need to think about the spatial relationships between those communities, as well as their linguistic relationships. They might have shared, in some sense, quite similar linguistic origins by emanating from Ireland, or at least having an Irish connection, but they're occupying different places within the city itself in the 10th century. Moving on in time a little bit to another important group in Chester is, of course, the Welsh. And this is from the work of Helen Fulton, and I quite liked it. And I thought at this point in time, and I've been already talking for far too long, I can see, I thought it'd be quite an interesting, if not quite amusing, commentary on how the Welsh saw Chester in the 14th and 15th century. So these are slightly later sources, the ones I've just been talking about. The poem is on the right-hand side in English. If you want to read it in Welsh, it's on the left-hand side. I won't read it in Welsh because I don't speak Welsh. The flavour of weak ivy intoxicates the English, the poet says. The flavour of husks and pollution. The flavour of the water from the town's 3 rivers. The flavour of Chester's beer. A dog wouldn't touch it. You know, it's very pejorative and dismissive of the quality of the beer that was being offered by the English within Chester to the Welsh. At least that's how it might be read in the poem. But what's interesting, this is a slightly larger passage there. What's interesting, I think, is how the Welsh themselves in Chester, it's quite a long quotation here from Jane Lawton's work on Chester. The Welsh themselves are also very important in brewing beer, paradoxically. So not only was the Welsh poet able to drink the beer being brewed by English brewers in Chester, they could also have drunk Welsh beer as well, or beer brewed by Welshmen. And they were largely concentrated, again, thinking about marginality, peripherality, liminality, on the other side of the River Dee, on the Welsh side of the River Dee, if you like, at Hanbridge, a small suburb, where they are certainly present by the end of the 15th century, as you can see there in the quotation. The longer passage helps us think through how those Welsh-speaking inhabitants in Chester in the late 15th century themselves were trying to communicate to those who did not speak Welsh, i.e. the civic elite. So the city clerks, mentioned here by Jane Lawton, she says, thanking or being thankful of the fact that these Welsh inhabitants were changing their names, to anglicizing their names to appear more English. And again, it's that kind of acculturation, which how did that operate on a day-to-day level? Knowing in an English city that these are outsiders, as it were. In fact, the Welsh at one point were expelled from Chester, but they were outsiders socially and culturally, but also at the same time needing to be assimilated into the city. They're part of the fabric, of the commercial fabric of the city. And the way they're doing that is by changing their names, or in the case of the civic elite, writing phonetically the names that they hear, like Dolgelly instead of Dolgelly. So this is, again, this kind of interesting insight into the position of that community on the edge of Chester, but also the ways in which that marginal community is being assimilated into the city. Now, my fourth point here, I'm going to have to move through quite quickly because of time, but it's sort of taking a step back from what's going on in those localities to think, again, a little bit more about the bigger picture, but as well as that, looking at the importance of time in all of this. So I mentioned the different linguistic layers in the landscape, but let's think also about the landscape as a space of flows. This is the quotation from Manuel Castells, which you can see there, thinking about cities as connected. The interface between places and flows, and between cultures and social interests. And I think this is what, when we think about language and multilingualism in the city, what we're really thinking about is that mobility. The word was used earlier on, I think, by Catalin, and communication. You know, that is really what we're thinking about here. It's about movement of speech as well, vocalizing, verbalizing, but also the mobility of communities in and between themselves, and how they interconnect and rub up against each other linguistically. And Chester is very much about that kind of mobility. You know, is a space of flow. The quayside itself, the importance of the river as a way of channeling information and people and goods and so on, obviously in, but also out. So what we have in Chester is that interface between the outside world and the inside world of the city, which is what we were reading really when we were looking at Lucian's account of Chester and Chester's relationship to the wider world. and Higden as well. And the rows as those places within the city where that kind of interplay, interchange at the social and cultural level linguistically was taking place. And it was just, I wanted to highlight some of those to you. I won't spend a lot of time on this. This was just to make the broader point with Lucian, how Lucian is constantly situating Chester in relation to that wider world. He talks about Ireland. You see these points here highlighted. The north coast is set opposite the north coast of Ireland. He talks here about Chester having 4 gates. The east, from the east, it looks towards India, from the west towards Ireland, to Greater Normandy to the north, and then to the Welsh. And this is, in this particular set of passages, something which really reminds us of that networking, that space of flows with it, which Chester represents in the 12th century. Port of ships coming from Aquitaine, from Spain, from Ireland, from Germany. The fishermen, there's that ebb and flow, that mobility, that transient nature of the city. So, but not, as I said earlier on, not kind of a cacophony or a babble, but these people are communicating with each other. They need to communicate for the sense of business, for the sense of commercial trade, and so on and so forth. So they're not competing with each other. They need to communicate. Those simultaneous voices need to connect with each other. So you maybe want to read these passages at your leisure. They are available on our Mapping Medieval Chester website. But I do want to just, because of time moving against me here, to think a little bit about how that importance of time relates to the different communities and their languages, and how their languages relate to each other through particular practices within the city, including the processional plays in Chester, which were being performed in the vernacular, it's important to say. So in vernacular, in what we now will call Middle English, being verbalized and vocalized in particular localities around the city. You can see the roots here. And one of those roots, I did some work on this in City and Cosmos. This is a modern photograph, obviously, of what one of these plays is like today in the context of York, but helps us to visualize again this sort of stage, the city as a stage, where these different kinds of dramas of the everyday are played out. This is the painting I showed you earlier, and this is Watergate Street. And I want to just more or less end with Watergate Street, because again in the 15th century it was and because it was close to the quayside, was an area that was occupied by different communities with different linguistic identities. So different languages being spoken. We have those from the Isle of Man, who would have spoken Manx, which is a form of Gaelic. They may or may not have been able to communicate with those who were speaking Gaelic, that is to say the Irish, who also lived in Watergate. And these different quotations here from Jane Norton's work highlights the occupations of some of those from the Isle of Man, the brothels that they operated in Watergate Street, primarily because of its location close to the port, but also how they would have communicated with their clientele. Let's face it, whether they're speaking, obviously they presumably would have been speaking in their native tongue to each other, but also how to verbalize and vocalize in other languages, including, of course, English, to those who would have been the majority of their clientele. So there's a relationship between those two groups themselves, the Irish women and the Manx women in these brothels along Watergate Street, as well as their place within the wider community on Watergate Street itself. And those coming and going, not just from the city itself, but through the port. So, drilling down to these little details of individual streets, of different communities, occupying in a sense the same location, but representing different linguistic traditions, different linguistic communities, I think is an interesting thing for us to think about in relation to the timing of this, because Watergate Street, you can see from the yellow line there, Watergate Street was one of the processional routes of those Corpus Christi plays being performed in English. And one might say perhaps one of the roles of these plays was to sacralize or to sanctify the city. And, as an interesting thought there about why the route itself is moving down Watergate Street with all these kinds of dubious and nefarious kinds of activities going on, which were being represented in those different passages there. And this is from Watergate Street as well, again, 19th century painting, but kind of gives us a sense of perhaps that kind of multi-layered nature of the urban landscape in Watergate Street, multilingually complex, but also actually as a landscape and as a place quite complex as well. So, sorry, I've gone on way too long here. How does a city speak? We've been talking and thinking a little bit about that ourselves, all these different levels. The voices that we hear, these many different languages coming together in one place, they're not necessarily competing with each other. The point about these people speaking different languages is they're communicating with each other for their self-identity, but they're also having to make provision for speaking and communicating with those who do not speak their languages. And we might want to think about how that plays out in space and place through the place of locution, through different expressions and idioms and so on. By way of conclusion then, what I've been trying to do here is think about the importance of mapping. That's what I said at the very start, to map linguistically those negotiating and inhabiting urban space and places. And we've just been looking at one city for more or less one time period. And what we see is a very complicated and complex, multi-layered picture of languages being spoken, competing with each other perhaps, but also being communicated with each other as well, simultaneously, but also over time. And I think thinking about chronology here, the longer time span, as well as time in terms of the everyday experience, is another thing for us to perhaps to bring into our discussions, not just the spatial, but the temporal as well, when we begin to think about language, the identities of those who are using languages at particular times, the trades that they do, we might speaking English for their particular trade in one context, but in their home life, speaking another language if they're from the Isle of Man or from Ireland, which is different to the language that they're using in the context of their particular activities. And then also the communication between, as I've mentioned, between those communities, between themselves and within themselves. So when we hear the city, we will hear particular voices, particular languages, as we do today when we walk around our cities, the cities that we are familiar with today. We might want to think about the cultural traces, these locales of orality, as I put it here, the cultural traces that are left behind in the landscape, especially through the naming of places, the kind of residue or accretion of language through toponyms. And that's how we often hear the city of the past, is through the toponyms, not just the textual and visual sources, the manuscripts and so on, but the urban landscape itself has a polyvocality. We can begin to hear the city through the toponyms, and mapping is a way of helping us to visualize those. So then my final point then really is that when we're listening to the city, we might want to think about it more as symphonic, as something which is not a cacophony, not necessarily voices competing or languages competing with each other, like a babble, but more as a kind of a community of different voices being spoken at different times for different reasons, but at the heart of it, the importance of communicating and building cohesion between communities, within cities and between cities as well. And I said I'd end with this. In our Discover Medieval Chester project, Catherine Clark, who's a fantastic principal investigator on this project, managed to get a commissioned piece of public art here at St. John's Church, which is partly ruined, as you can see, and projecting onto the church the multilingual heritage of Chester being brought to life through the different scripts, the different languages projected onto St. John's. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I've gone on for far too long, probably left no time for discussion at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Keith, for this illuminating lecture, which was really a symphony, not only of various languages, but also various approaches, various topics, various mappings, various sources. So I think it will give us food for thought for all three workshop series. I hope you will be back. And also, even if time is working against us, as you have noted, I would like to give some space or some opportunity for discussion, for questions before we go to our, there's a kind of echo here.
It's because both hours, so it's coming to Keith, he's hearing it, but then it's coming back again.
Yeah, but can we help avoiding it?
Does that help? Try again now.
Yes, hopefully now the echo is gone. Yeah, I think that's very good. So questions, comments, any reflections on Keith's very rich polyphonic keynote lecture? Yeah, Paulina, I don't know, let's try if you speak from your own place, but if not, you can either come here to the mic.
I will just try. Do you hear me?
No.
I can hear you, and I'm sorry I can't seem to make myself visible anymore. So I don't know
You're
what
visible, yeah.
I am visible.
Okay, you are.
Okay.
Okay, I will just try to speak aloud. Do you have some data on the immigration into the city, say between 1200
Shall I
and
switch
1500?
between the two?
Are there some sources? Who were the people coming into the city? Who were people who stayed there, who left again? Did they build communities which would be ethnically, linguistically homogeneous, or just they did not? Is there any data for Chester in this respect?
I'm really sorry, I can't hear you at all.
The previous version was better, so you switched something in the wrong direction, because when we first heard Paulina, it was much better. So switch it back to the previous.
Okay, try now.
Right now. Okay. Again. Wonderful.
Much better, much better. Leave it like that.
Okay, wonderful. Do you have any data or sources on the immigration into the city, say between 1200, 1500? If the people stay there in the city, did they build homogeneous ethnical and linguistic communities, or did they not? Are there something about this?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yes, there would be. The way this is normally constructed by historians in an English context is to use people's surnames as evidence of migration patterns, and I'm sure it's the same in Europe as well. So now again, Jane Lawton has used court records in particular to look at the social fabric of Chester. So what I think is interesting is apart from the Welsh examples I gave you there, is the way in which does seem to be a certain amount of clustering, like I indicated with Watergate Street, but more broadly, with the medieval English city, there tends to be quite a mixed sort of social makeup, if you like, spatially within the city itself. So, you're not necessarily getting enclaves or particular groups of people. The Welsh example there in Hanbridge is not exclusively Welsh. It's not an enclave just for Welsh people. It is a suburb where Welsh people aggregate, where they accumulate, and again, we see this in our modern day cities, do we not? Where people who have come from different parts of the world may well stick together, at least to begin with. And I think that's what we're seeing in Chester in the period you're talking about in the 12th and 13th century, when Chester is very much that sort of global in a European medieval sense, a global city. It is very much an interconnected city. So those different cultural influences are being represented. But it is a kind of, I think we should be cautious about sort of reading too much into those aggregations of people. I think it's very, people aren't being put in a particular place, but they are occupying a particular place.
Yeah, thank you very much. Further questions, comments? Yes, Lena?
Yes, thank you very much. Do you hear me? I hope so.
Just about.
Okay, I just wanted to ask if you have any sources from the local administration that explicitly address the difficulties of these different languages, like the need for translators because someone only spoke Manx or whatever, and also in which language the records of the administration are written.
Yeah, well, actually, that's a good question. I'll be honest. I mean, I haven't worked on the civic records of Chester. So you'd need somebody like Jane Lawton, again, whose name I've already mentioned, is a historian of the city itself, the medieval city, and does go into quite a lot of detail into the workings of the civic government, but also the various people living and working in the city. But at this particular time, I'm just thinking to other examples, and the one that I'm more familiar with in terms of civic administration is Bristol, which is probably not dissimilar to Chester in the sense that it is an Atlantic port city looking to the Irish Sea with connections to Dublin. And its civic register by Rickart, at least in the later period, the late 15th century, where we do have a chronicle written by Rickart, one of the town clerks, is in English by and large. I mean, some of it is in Latin. So we're going to maybe get a sense of an ability to switch between at that level, excuse me, at that level operating in terms of the civic elite, operating between two linguistic communities, those writing things in Latin, I'm losing my voice now, but also communicating obviously in English.
Yeah, thank you very much. That would have been very much my question as well, of how much of this linguistic polyphony find its way to the written record, because not only for the particular case of Chester, but to remind us how selected the range of languages and language use is that we can actually study through the written record. So yeah. I think you would give the same response to this question, that there are just really one layer which may vary from one city to the other, and that may also be part of our comparative research, how much of this polyphony can be grasped from those written sources that we traditionally look at, and how much we should also consider the additional sources like the toponyms or like the patron saints of various ecclesiastic establishments, in addition to narrative sources telling about, or court cases telling about people doing certain things whose voices are not recorded in the written form.
Yeah, I think the one example I showed you there of the Welsh surnames being anglicised by the clerks might be that kind of an example of that sort of trying to make sense of something which is not in their own language. But it's not a formal process of translation. It's just trying to make sense, writing things down phonetically, for example, which again is what we do today, isn't it? If we don't understand, we don't know the language, but we write down the word, even if we don't know particularly how it's spelt. So I think there's something in that, Catalin, which I think I need to think a bit more about. But yes, that interplay between those who are doing the recording and whose voices, in a sense, we are privileging because we have the written record to work from, and how they themselves are mediating the voices of others. I think it's an important point.
Yes, I think my archaeologist colleagues very often talk about taphonomy. So what is lost in various stages of how sources come down to us. And I think there is already a kind of taphonomy in the process of putting something into writing by some people and not by the others.
That's right, yeah.
Any other questions? Jessica, please.
A much more specific question. How do you think
for you it's easy.
Okay. How do you think the revolt of Owen Glendower would have affected the soundscape in Chester? But that's extremely specific, I know, but I'm curious.
Could you just repeat that again? Sorry, slightly.
I think maybe this might, is that better?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, how do you think the revolt of Owen Glendower would have affected the soundscape in Chester? Because one of the names, it seemed to change in that kind of late 14th, early 15th century period. Is that having an effect? Yeah,
well, this is that period is really interesting. Thank you very much for the question. Yes, in the 15th century, I mean, Chester, and as you know, in the 13th century, was always a really significant jumping off point for the English into Wales. And clearly seen very much by the Welsh, as you saw from that poem, as a city where, basically it's a city where the English power is emanating from in Wales. So yes, it is a point of conflict in that sense. And the Welsh were expelled from Chester, but at one particular, but it never actually came to much, in the sense that the Welsh seemed to still survive in the city, still came to inhabit the city. But it must have, I'm sure you're right. I mean, these sorts of broader political trends and events and so on must have had an impact on the perception of those living within the city, of how the Welsh were being perceived by the English inhabitants. And let's face it, you're an English inhabitant if you speak English. So, these things are very self-evident. in an urban context, aren't they? You know, if you, as soon as you open your mouth and start talking, it's not just about dress and appearance and so on, but speech is really important in this. And you can begin to imagine there may well be arising from the kinds of conflicts more broadly between English and Welsh, not just in the 14th and 15th centuries, but earlier as well, you know, that these sorts of conflicts would have actually had an impact on the relations and the social relations within the city itself. Yeah, it's again, it's about looking at the wider context, the wider landscape, I think is important. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think bringing in the political aspects and bringing in the conflicting aspects, because you emphasized the symphony, and indeed, as a rule, people manage to understand each other, but the breaking points and the points where this multilingual communication did not serve the same purposes any longer can and should, I think, also be in the focus of our attentions. And I'm hoping to get examples and case studies throughout the workshops also in this respect. Yes, further points at this moment? If that's not the case, then thank you very much, Keith, for joining us. Thank you for bringing in all these various voices which can take us further, not only to the first, but also the second and the third workshops as well. And I do hope that you may be able to join us for one of the later workshops in person, and then you can engage in dialogue and discussion with the participants also face to face. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathleen.
And with this, we stop the hybrid part of our session. So unfortunately for the rest, we cannot listen to Keith's comments to perhaps the lectures, but we start or go on with our coffee break now. So there are some refreshments waiting for you just outside the room. I'm afraid, Keith, you have to resort to your own refreshments.
Yeah.
We say goodbye to you. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
And we will... those in the classroom or the room here will reconvene at 11 o'clock.